Thanks, Mel. Bravely made this step for the next 5 months. Most of you, if I've worked with you, you'll know me from such things as urban wetlands and stormwater management plans and the like. But the foray into policy is quite deliberate, trying to bring some practical understanding to what we do, but also in reverse trying to re-engineer my brain to understand policy. So today I'll give you just a brief overview of some of the alternative funding models for stormwater management that we've been looking at, and I first of all need to acknowledge my colleague Jess Van Riel here, who did all of the background work to this. And I also want to just let you know this is provided to you without prejudice, so it's been prepared for consultation purposes. It hasn't gone anywhere other than within the department at this stage, and it would be subject to decisions made at a later date. It should become, or we hope that we can make some further decisions about where it heads. But in the meantime, really this is just setting the scene for some of the options that we've considered, and it's a digest only. You'll note that I'll probably race through it, and that's in an attempt just to get through at least some of the more, let's not say important, but the more strategically obvious ones to us. Thank you. Well, most of you will probably have seen this figure by now. It describes a city's evolution from water supply city on your far left, in which our earliest challenges was just to keep our citizens watered, through to the more holistic integration of the full water cycle into city design and operation on your far left here, far right here. The stormwater management issues that SA faces are no different to, or not unusual on a world scale, and certainly no different to other cities that have been designed for efficient drainage and flood protection. But in recent decades, South Australia has tried to challenge itself, has been challenged by the transition from being a drained city through its current designation as a water cycle city, and people in the room might debate about where we are along that transition, but we know from consultation that largely we consider ourselves to be a water cycle city. And in the future, we're going to have to try to transition ourselves into a more modern and water efficient, water sensitive city. And of those challenges ahead, perhaps the biggest one is how we're going to fund that transition, and to that end, what kind of mechanism we have that will transition ourselves towards a mechanism which is more responsive to change, effective in its treatment, and efficient in its investment. So with that challenge in mind, and in fact that challenge itself has been brought into even sharper focus in recent years, and that's through the continuing ageing and in fact failure of some of our older assets, damages from frequent and unseasonal weather events, and think back to September just last year, and we don't need a long memory to understand what that means for us. And looking ahead, perhaps predictions for more intense storms of the kind that we had last year into the future, and you superimpose upon all that the insatiable growth in hard-paved urbanisation, which we still seem to be negotiating our way through. And meanwhile, that expenditure on whole-of-cycle stormwater management is unable to keep pace not only with the current situation, but the future and future implications and future scenario which might see higher and potentially more damaging stormwater flow events. So it's in that case that we need a more reliable, sustainable income stream for stormwater management, and in particular, we need a better level of service to successfully meet future challenges, particularly given the $800 million liability that we estimate currently sits before us. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I heard the author of that figure talk about or introduce billion to his lexicon. So the challenge is certainly stark. It needs to be dedicated and sustainable, so that current income sources that we attribute or contribute towards stormwater management, involving taxes, council rates and levies, don't sufficiently respond to stormwater need, and more than that, they're exposed to other sources of competition for those limited funds, and neither are they particularly fair or equitable in the way that the funds are either raised or spent. Market-based mechanisms have been not only in trial but in use in Australia, particularly in water management, for some decades now, and they're well proven and they work very well. We've used them in South Australia for the allocation of important ground and surface water resources, and we have a fairly mature market now in South Australia, and that's led to some of the best irrigators in Australia simply because of the way that the market works. We've even applied them to bush care activities with more limited success, but we know they work, and so there's no reason that couldn't be expanded to stormwater management in South Australia in future years. If we're going to do that, there's a whole bunch of questions we need to ask ourselves, and maybe at the core of that is questions around equity, stability, simplicity and feasibility. So, for example, in relation to equity, how important is the issue of who pays for stormwater services? Should contributions be linked to the services provided? Should financial incentives be provided for on-site stormwater control? In relation to stability, in consideration of the inherent risks associated with stormwater management, what income stability do we think it deserves, and how important is long-term planning and program success? And I'm sure the answer there we would all give is that, of course, early and long-term planning is important in developing long-term cost-effective solutions. Simplicity, how important is it to keep the funding program simple? We don't know who will administer it, but whoever might will need to be factored into how simple that program or how complex that program can be. But not only the administrator, but the community we're trying to sell it to and the messages we're trying to sell. An overridingly important question after you've considered all of those others is what's economically and politically feasible to achieve for your community and your situation, and that is a fundamental question in anything we do. It has to be accepted by the people and the community that we're serving, and so it has to be explicable in terms that they can understand. So with regard to current works and current sources to fund works, we have general taxes, property-based rates and other charges, and that includes local government rates, stormwater infrastructure charges, and even the NRM levy, which, as we heard, is funding stormwater management works across the region. We also have grants and loans, and they can be from state and federal government, although they are few and far between. And for that reason, local government tends to use the local government financing authority as the cheapest way of borrowing for major works. But into the future, there are other options that are available to us, and none of these are particularly new, except perhaps for green bonds, but we don't tend to use them very well here in Australia, and they include stormwater user charge, credit trading, offset schemes and green bonds. I'll go on into a little bit of detail on those now. The stormwater utility fee, and it's also referred to as the user fee, was first developed in the United States, and it's now used, Andy, you can tell me if I'm wrong, now used by over 1,500 stormwater management authorities in the US, so something must be right. But beyond that, it's also now applied in South America, Canada, New Zealand, and even in New South Wales. In New South Wales, they've also been subjected to rate capping, and so they've seen this as a particularly useful tool to extend the resources they have to deal with the problems that they've got. The mechanism treats stormwater as a paid public service in much the same way that the citizen might purchase electricity, and contributions or the fee payment is based on how much runoff the property contributes, essentially using an algorithm that would include impervious area in its calculation. Its advantages are that it's fair and equitable, it's transparent, as well. It uses the user pays principle, in which a fee is paid proportional to the service consumed. The fee is then dedicated and stable, so it allows more certainty in planning and programming of your works. And if it's coupled with a credit program, it provides an incentive for source control to reduce stormwater runoff and pollutant discharge. It can be used to build a reserve of funds, importantly, for infrastructure into the future, and with that, it can allow greater leveraging of third-party funds. Like everything in life, it does have its disadvantages, and there are additional implementation costs, and that's particularly at the setup phase, and it can include such things as feasibility studies. So there's a tremendous amount of work in getting the system right, and that's all got to be borne by the developer in the early stages. In designing an appropriate revenue structure, it can be burdensome. Can also be relatively straightforward. There are a number of schemes already in use around the world, and so it doesn't have to be reinvented. We could certainly rely on some of the work that's gone before us. And when I first started in MBIs, what it must be 10 or 15 years ago, I was told to aim for second best. If you really wanted to aim for perfection, you would never get it done. And I know if Professor Mike Young was here, he says the same thing, has said the same thing for many times. Don't wait till it's perfect, just make a start and develop along the way. And I think that's what we should probably be striving for here. And so there are advantages and disadvantages. Perhaps another advantage, though, is that it presents a more holistic way of undertaking stormwater management, in that it facilitates the consolidation and condensing, if you like, of stormwater funding management responsibilities from the distributed and diverse way that we currently manage stormwater to a more centralised manner. Now, I'm looking forward to hearing Andy perhaps talk more about this a bit later. In relation to infrastructure charges, they are levies. They're a one-time charge, and they are applied to private developers, and they essentially help, and I think we heard Craig talk about this just previously, help governments recover infrastructure costs associated with extending those services, the public services, to private developments. The underlying principle is that the developer pays for the cost of connecting the proposed development to the main drainage system or other form of stormwater infrastructure. Charges are levied when there is an increase in the value of land, and they're often based on net developable land, such as the number or the aerial extent of the residential developments. And the revenue derived from these charges can only be used to fund eligible capital costs and services for which they're collected. And in this case, it could be pipelines, curbs, gutters, more intelligent stormwater infrastructure, green infrastructure type of arrangements. I guess the advantage here is that it's well established, which is not to say that there's not opposition from developers, but it is well established amongst the development community across Australia, and it tend to be applied more equitably, in that it does use the area of development as the basis for the charge. And it's also, perhaps a side benefit is that it's also recognised by the National Water Initiative in their pricing principles, and that, if nothing else, helps defending the charge when it's applied with the community and developers. There are a number of disadvantages with this approach, and the fact that it's tied to development growth and growth rates means that it's cyclical in nature, so it's particularly exposed to downturns in the market, and it's only limited to capital costs. The development does not include life cycle operating and maintenance costs, so that's a major gap for local government, who is often required to take up the brunt in the decades that precede. And there's also a potential disparity between the charges and the real cost of doing the work, again leaving another gap for local government to take up. And I'm sure that many from local government here would probably have been exposed to the disadvantage that it impacts on housing affordability, well, in fact, that might be the case, but even the Productivity Commission suggests that that's a fairly minimal risk, and it still presents a reasonable approach or way forward. Offsets are a particularly interesting and exciting approach. They allow the developer to pay an offset where it's not technically or economically feasible to achieve best practice stormwater management on their own site. And the offset is calculated using a proxy pollutant. In Australia, this has been achieved using nitrogen and salinity. And it's also considered to be more effective at managing stormwater quality as opposed to stormwater volume. However, it is only generally limited to new developments. It's not universally applied, and because of their focus on the development phase, it's not set up to address the longer-term operational issues. It is fair, though. It reflects sustainable pricing principles, and as I suggest, it can be more cost-effective to aggregate your stormwater solutions off-site rather than distribute them on the development site and across the development site. That's not always the case, but research in Australia suggests that's possible. The disparity between the levy charge and the real cost of building the asset makes it disadvantageous to some, and in fact, in recent years, Melbourne Water's had to increase their charge significantly simply just to cover the cost of implementation. I might move on. I might note that there is some research, and we might have some researchers in the room. There's some researchers going on at the moment in relation to this, using the Lefevre Peninsula as a test case or a case study, and it'd be interesting to see what comes of that. Stormwater credit trading enables property owners who are subject to an on-site retention or treatment requirement to meet portion of their requirements by buying credits from other property owners rather than building all the stormwater management infrastructure on their own property. It's becoming increasingly popular because it introduces flexibility into development rules and requirements, and if designed correctly, can create equal or better water quality outcomes than simple on-site retention requirements. It's a cost-effective, efficient and flexible option in meeting stormwater management goals in that it considers capacity and capability to deliver certain outcomes without diminishing the overall outcome, of course assuming that it's designed appropriately. And I'll move on because I'm running out of time. The disadvantages include the fact that there is uncertainty experienced by buyers and sellers that there will be adequate supply or demand for credits. You can't know that when establishing a market for the first time. And allied to that is that the trading scheme requires a rate of development that creates enough of a market to merit the cost of the program startup and ongoing administration in the first case. I'll move on to this by just noting that in Washington DC they have what could be considered a role model for other cities, not only in the US but around the world, and it aims to offset costly expansion and maintenance of stormwater infrastructure by allowing developers to build stormwater management facilities on site and sell credits generated through the installation of green infrastructure and the like to older developments where they can't effectively or efficiently manage their own stormwater on site. Green bonds are relatively new, even on a world scale, but they are becoming very popular and growing rapidly. It's a multi-billion-dollar market these days. They're a fixed income financial instrument that secures a debt that is linked in some way to developing green solutions or projects, and they can potentially be used for stormwater projects even here in Australia. I mentioned the fact that it's growing rapidly. We do have a green bond market here in Australia, and in fact in 2016 the Vic government issued around $300 million in green bonds, and even just this year Queensland around $750 million in green bonds. And they are climate standard certified green bonds. That doesn't mean that they're applied to stormwater, but it can extend to stormwater as well. There's nothing in SA that I know of or that we know of at this point. And there's also such a thing, which is even newer, called environmental impact bonds, and then they haven't been applied, to our knowledge, haven't been applied here in Australia yet. They provide a return based on performance of environmental sustainability outcomes, and understandably, they appeal to investors that fit a certain risk and return profile. Like other bonds, they provide an immediate benefit for capital improvement where this cannot be achieved when relying on current revenue. And there are a number of disadvantages. Because of its relative newness, the bond market is still relatively fragmented. It's not subject to universal regulation. And whilst it's worth billions of dollars, many billions of dollars worldwide, if not applied in accordance with standard climate bond initiative standards, they can be simply used as a method of greenwashing for what is essentially a regular corporate bond. So look, I'll just move on to some concluding comments, and this might be something we are able to consider in the session this afternoon in terms of what the state can do in assisting its communities to overcome the challenges that we've heard from Mayor Evans and Craig. First of all, identifying options and evaluating benefits and appropriateness of those options. All communities differ in terms of revenue needs and their ability to implement funding and financing options, and so different approaches might need to be considered. Organisations like JUNA can offer politically independent advice regarding the best options for a community. We can't make decisions on behalf of politicians, small p politicians, whether they operate at a state or local government level. But perhaps through the independent bodies that we can let them know what the consequences of their decisions are and trust that they can be steered accordingly. What we can do at a state government level across the various departments is promote and fund demonstration projects. Demonstration projects, we've all delivered them and we know just how effective they can be in creating confidence and developing a critical mass of support, particularly in situations where project concepts are difficult to grasp, and that's particularly the case with alternative funding mechanisms for stormwater, where they can simply be viewed as another tax. And lastly, promote collaboration through local and state government agencies and non-profits, and effectively that's why we're here today. Thank you for your time.